Scott, Nunnery, premises liability practice leader, also at the Rimkus Consulting Group. T. Scott is an architect with Rimkus. He's also a certified XL tribometrist, which my first question is going to be, T. Scott, please share with us what that is, and I'm sure you will. But he's to talk to us about why you don't always need slip testing. Fascinating perspective. Take it away, Mr. Nunnery.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Yeah, the word tribometrist means that I'm practiced in using tribometry machines, and it all has to do with slip resistance testing. Tribometers are pieces of equipment that test slip resistance of surfaces, walking surfaces typically. I have it certified XL tribometrist. That means that there's a particular piece of equipment out there that we use among multiple pieces of equipment at Rimkus called the English XL. And I've gone through their training courses and certification courses to be able to use that machine and properly represent it and utilize the information. Next slide, please. So the presentation's titled, Why You Don't Always Need Slip Testing, and really the intent of the presentation is to make a distinction between dry slip resistance testing and wet slip resistance testing, and to understand what the results of wet slip resistance testing really means. Next slide. So what I want to do is start off with a scenario. Imagine this in your mind. We've got a scenario in which someone, we're going to call him a plaintiff, has slipped on a wet interior floor. The floor material really could be anything. It could be tile that you find in a restaurant dining space. It could be sealed concrete that you find in a big box hardware store. It could be linoleum in a big box department store. Or it could be granite flooring, like you polished granite stone flooring that you typically see in lobbies of office buildings and often hotels. What the typical scenario is that somebody slips and falls, and an expert's hired to go out and perform slip testing on that floor. And as part of that slip testing, what they do is they go ahead and test it in a dry state without any water, but they then also use a tribometer to also test it with some water or some wetting of the surface. And what they do is they generate results and come up with a valuation or a measurement that is used to compare it to industry standard thresholds, I'm going to call it, for an easy term, that we typically refer to in terms of levels of safety of the floor. And lo and behold, what you find out is the expert comes back and tells you that the wet floor surface would not be considered slip resistant when it's wet. Next slide. So now what do you do when you're being told that the floor surface doesn't meet standards in a wet condition? The implication is that the floor material is unsuitable and that it's maybe possibly improper and maybe not appropriate for the use. And that obviously has great implications for not only the situation of having people slip and fall, but of course, what does that mean for you for future situations and such like that? And I think that the next slide, if we can go to that. I think the important thing to realize is that most interior flooring surfaces would not be considered slip resistant when wet. And if that were the case, then we'd have millions and millions of square feet of flooring throughout the U.S. and the world that would be improper. And of course, all these flooring materials, a lot of them have been around for years and years and years, and used by millions and millions of people. and get occasional slip and fall. But if we really look at this material and think of it in terms of whether or not it's slip resistant when wet or when contaminated with any kind of material, whether it be oil or anything like that, we're going to find that most of those materials do not meet the standard of slip resistance. Next slide, please. So the important distinction for this is determining that wet slip resistance of a floor that was intended to be used in the dry condition was designed, was installed in a dry condition. It does not determine whether or not there was negligence on the part of the party being sued. In other words, because some material was installed, say we'll go back to the flooring material of the lobby of a hotel, you find that in a dry condition, you never have an issue of somebody slipping and falling. But suddenly there's some kind of event that occurs and it's wetted and somebody slips and falls. It's really comes down to a different component of the whole matter that's really most important, and it really has less to do with whether or not the material was really intended to be slip resistant when wet. They just weren't. They were installed dry. They were intended to be walked on dry, and the other issues that come up we'll talk about in a moment. Next slide. So, as I've said, the buildings, essentially the built environment, including buildings and their elements, they're designed for their intended use. Hotel lobbies are intended to have a lot of people moving around, walking and passing through them. The floors, the floor system is really no different from any other component in terms of an intended use. Floors are intended to be used dry and really are only meant to meet a slip resistance criteria in the dry condition. Next slide. So what I've done is I've referenced a couple of published standards and codes here that have language making it clear that slip resistance values for floor surfaces should be consistent with their intended use. And again, the two that I have listed here are ANSI standards, American National Standards Institute. They publish standards and address issues of slip resistance and also walking surfaces, safe walking surfaces. There's a document A137.1 that specifically has language in there that interior space is expected to be walked on when wet, should have a particular type of slip resistance. Then ANSI A326.3 has language that specifies that friction testing of a walkway surface should match the intended use. Next slide. So similarly, there also are some codes out there, NFPA 101. In the commentary for that particular document, that's National Fire Protection, they actually have a statement: the foreseeable slip conditions that are those that are, are those that are likely to be present at the location of the walking surface during the use of the building area. The ASTM International Standard F1637, going back to that, states interior walkways that are not slip resistant when wet shall be maintained dry during periods of pedestrian use. The point of really bringing and showing these is, again, to show that all of the publications and documentation out there is really accepting and understanding of the fact that walkway surfaces and such are really intended to be dry. Now, for most surfaces. Now, it's true that you also have surfaces that say around pool decks, in saunas and areas like that, where you end up having walking surfaces that are intended to be, or most likely going to be wet. They're foreseeable. It is foreseeable that they'll end up being wet at some point. And certainly, In those situations, it makes sense to think in terms of testing if somebody slips and falls to go ahead and test them in those conditions, in a wet condition. But the point here, the most important point to carry away here is that most services, again, the hotel walkways, the box store floors are not intended to be wet. They're intended to be dry. And if we can go to the next slide, what that brings up then is the questions of cause. What causes the floor to be wet in the first place? The common scenario for, say, a hotel lobby is it's dry, and you get people that are coming and going. They'll be walking across the floor with, say, an open drink or a drink that's dripping, and they'll end up leaving some kind of droplets of water and moisture on the floor. They'll just flat out spill on the floor and perhaps not really say anything to anyone about it. And or you can have a situation where somebody's pulling a cooler or something, or full of ice across the floor, and they don't have it well sealed, or they're lifting it up and rolling across the floor and it's dripping on the floor. The real question that comes out of that then is should and that happens, and then somebody comes along a few moments later and slips and falls. So the question then that comes up is was that particular wet situation foreseeable by the hotel staff, by those in charge of monitoring the floors and such like that? Was that something that they should have anticipated and seen? Is it realistic to have somebody standing in the hotel following people around with a mop or whatever means of mitigation there's, making sure that somebody doesn't drop liquid or something on the floor, some kind of debris on the floor? Yeah, that's unrealistic. The question really comes up of once that occurs and somebody does slip and fall within moments of having the floor contaminated with water, whatever it may be, how long was there between the time that it became wet and the time of the incident when somebody fell? And like I said, was there any kind of notice given to the staff, to employees, such that they'd have time to react, so that they'd be able to go ahead and implement the protocols for properly mitigating the wet areas? Did the person that dropped the drink or spilled the drink, did they let the staff or the employees know that they had spilled that and dropped it? And of course, what we find most often is a lot of people, no, they don't. Unfortunately, they either they don't know it, they do it unwittingly, or when they do it, they're embarrassed or in a hurry and they just move on. Next slide, please. So really kind of then comes down to standard of care. Was the party being sued in conformance with typical floor maintenance protocols? Were employees properly trained? Were they trained on how to identify liquids on the floors and how to properly mitigate them in a timely manner? Were they trained on how to protect guests and employees from the liquid contamination? In other words, once they discovered or were informed of the contamination of the floor, did they know how to set up proper warning devices and to keep people away from anybody else stepping on and slipping in or stepping through the contamination and possibly extending that contamination to other parts of the floor? We often really need to be really focused on what the protocols were. Were regular inspections, were sweeps properly executed of the floor areas? Were people, the employees or staff, were they being diligent and following through on timely sweeps of the floor areas to ensure that areas like that were, the contaminations were spotted, debris was spotted and mitigated? That makes a big difference. We've had, we do a lot of work in Las Vegas and deal with slip and falls at a lot of the resorts there. And of course, the surveillance video is wonderful for that kind of thing, because we can often pick up when somebody or something happens that causes the wet floor to occur. And we're able to then also evaluate when hotel staff or employees had done their swept, had passed by there, and how quickly then once something is noted and it's brought to their attention, notice is given to them, that they react to it and that they go ahead and mitigate and take care of it. That kind of information is really just as important as whether or not the floor, somebody contaminates the floor and whether or not somebody slipped and fell, but rather keeping vigilant of that and having records of that, and knowing that they've checked, that the staff and employees have done their due diligence for checking for those things. And of course, part of the precautions that can be taken are, certainly in northern environments with snow and such like that, but even with rain as well. During the rainy seasons, during the snow seasons, are different things done to help mitigate and reduce the likelihood of floor contamination. Say the polished stone floor of the hotel lobby, our mats put down to help mitigate that and try to control that and manage how far in the moisture comes into the floor when people walk in from the exterior, from the outside, to reduce contamination throughout the floor area. And so things like that, we definitely always take into consideration and look at when we're evaluating the bigger picture of a floor and a slip and fall. Next slide. So in summary, there are times when slip resistance testing should be part of a slip and fall investigation. Going back to that, we typically, there's really no need to be slip testing in a wet condition for someone who has stumbled on a floor or slipped on a floor and it wasn't wet. But at the same time, with that, testing in a dry state, the machines, the tribometers, are set up like the English XL that I referenced earlier, are set up to test in a dry state and a wet state. But the dry state, we have an industry standard comparison that we use to determine whether or not the floor is considered slip resistant or not. In a wet condition, again, because the floor, a lot of these floor surfaces aren't intended to be wet, as we compare and we go ahead and do the testing and come up with a value or a measurement. The fact is, those measurements and valuations don't really mean a whole lot because of the fact that we're comparing it to a number that's really based on dry testing slip resistance. And so those numbers really are more of a comparative, but not anything that is an industry standard fix. The slip resistant testing should really be used only to compare floor finish that are intended for the conditions of use. So again, going back to that, if you've got a swimming pool and a pool deck at a hotel, and you've got a slip condition around the pool deck, then the numbers of measurements for measuring it dry or wet make sense. But certainly, again, in a hotel lobby where you don't expect it to be wet and it's intended to be dry, those numbers don't make so much sense to test wet. Last, I guess, the tribometry, the actual testing itself, I just want to emphasize it's just a tool. It's just a part of the overall investigation that needs to be done. You can't keep a hotel lobby floor dry all of the time, but you also can't possibly anticipate where somebody might spill or drop some water and create an issue. And the best you can do is make sure that you've got proper protocols in place for sweeping the areas, and I mean sweeping and walking and viewing and looking for issues like that, and then to have proper mitigation protocols in place to be able to address those issues. So Steve, I think that's all I have.
Yeah, thanks, T. Scott. That was good stuff. Very fascinating, especially because, as you know, slips and falls are really challenging for hotels and restaurants, as well as the casinos and any other place where people gather. So thank you very much for that. I've got a couple of questions just to start us off. So T. Scott, you mentioned some of the mitigation techniques like floor mats that we can put in. And of course, you made the point, and I think it's an excellent one. We have to use some pretty good judgment about how far into the building those floor mats need to go, right? Because people can track it a long way. But my question relates to umbrellas. Because, you know, when a big rain comes and people are using their umbrellas and they bring them in and they shake them out, do we have any mitigation techniques that I know you're not an umbrella expert. We didn't qualify you as that. But with your experience, what are some of the best practices that we can use when there's a big rainstorm and umbrellas are being done, or, you know, people are tracking the moisture in? You've got mats down, but I've seen these covers that can go over the umbrellas, or a box where people can put their umbrellas. Do those things, seems to me they help, but I want to hear from you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, you know, hence we have vestibules that we walk into. We try to utilize spaces like that. And I'm speaking from kind of a perspective of an architect. You know, I think that as from a management standpoint, when those kinds of conditions are present, and I'll bring up the umbrellas, you know, perhaps then when there is a rainstorm, that's something that can be identified and can be reacted to and noticed, and that you know, have somebody available or some means to be able to keep the umbrella from going inside the lobby and being shook out in there. But you know, the airlocks or vestibules that you walk into, you know, sometimes they'll be carpeted, sometimes they won't be. They'll have mats in them or something to that effect. But the important thing is that something like that is limited. But of course, it's the bottom line is that you can't keep any floor area perfectly dry. You just can't legislate that or you know, enforce that. And you know, so hence it really does come into a matter of good awareness and periodic sweeping and inspection of the floor areas for that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. If I can, sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I was going to say, relative to the mats, you know, how far the mats come in, kind of along the same lines, depending on the extent of the what the local, I guess, conditions are, would really kind of determine how many mats. I looked at a facility, a medical facility, at one time, and they had this beautiful polished stone floor in this huge lobby, and from the entrance all the way back, they had the service desk kind of on the far side of the lobby, so people had to go all the way through. Well, they had this train of mats from the front door all the way up to that service desk, and it was great because they didn't have slip and falls. But of course, you know, some of the issues that come up with that is then you end up introducing trip and falls over the mats. So, you know, one thing, nothing is without some other type of risk, I suppose. But it really does depend on what the local conditions are, on how you would set that up.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. And just at a higher view of your program, I'd like to see if you agree that just as I talked to the other folks about the need for cross-functional dialogue, I know you've seen over your career an evolution in hotel and restaurant spaces, but we get designers that choose flooring without conversing with the risk team, right? Or we're not teaching the training and education people about the specific challenges with a particular floor. So those cross-functional dialogues are crucial. I want to get to one other question. I don't see any in the chat just yet, but I want to get to one other question. 30 years ago, we did a study at the University of Houston where we found that less than 5% of all hotel customers actually physically took a bath. And yet 100% at that time of most hotels had bathtubs. Now, we finally penetrated the design concepts, and you're seeing more and more hotels with fewer bathtubs, more type walk-in shower type arrangements, right? I'm assuming you think that's a good trend. Is that a fair point? And the reason I bring it up is because we didn't make inroads with the industry until we connected the dots to another study where we found that most of the guest and employee slips and falls often were getting in and out of the bathtub.
Very good point. Very good point. There are different tribometers that are used for such things. There's a special machine that's used for that Rimkus has, and we use it for measuring bathtub surfaces for slip resistance. It's a very kind of specialized machine for that. But yes, we find that we often have scenarios or matters where somebody's either turning in the tub and they slip and fall within the tub, but also, as you pointed out, they are slipping and falling as they step out of the tub onto the tile floor, or I should say whatever floor surface there is in the bathroom with that. And of course, to answer your question, yeah, the walk-in showers help a lot, but you still have issues of whether or not how much water ends up being out on the floor in the bathroom. And so we do a lot of bathroom floor testing as well, whether it be, and we definitely typically do it in both wet and dry conditions to evaluate that. Is it a better thing? Yes, I think anytime you've got where you're not expecting somebody to step up and over the rim of a tub is always going to be a better scenario, because then you're introducing not just the slip and fall component, but you're introducing the trip and fall possibility of that as well. And of course, a lot of hotels have grab bar installations and things like that to help aid people these days, whereas 30 years ago that was kind of unheard of.
That's exactly right. And thank you for pointing out that just because we do a walk-in shower doesn't mean water isn't going to accumulate just outside that shower onto the floor when they step out of there, that may not be as slip resistant as the flooring in the shower itself, or they may not have the grab bars available to them there. That's a very good point. I want to get one last thing in real quick. I travel a lot internationally, and a lot of the hotels that I stay in internationally have removable shower heads. And I find them anecdotally to decrease my risk of slipping and falling inside the shower, right? Because I can remove the shower head to, clean my feet, things, lower legs, and I'm not trying to lift those up. Do you see that as a trend? And do you think it's a good one?
Yeah, I think that actually kind of comes from an accessibility viewpoint, in that if it's good for folks who are disabled and don't have the mobility. And sorry, Jordan, I may be kind of moving into that area and might be something you're addressing, but from an accessibility standpoint, anytime you can transfer some of that usefulness and flexibility to the general public, such that they're safer, they're not moving around and such like that, I think it's a great thing. Of course, again, as an architect speaking, there's other risks with that too. When you have a removable shower head, and I'm thinking of like a handheld wand, for example, you run the risk of having people misdirect the spray of water, and
Yes.
and so the bathrooms themselves would have to be, as from a design standpoint, would have to be designed appropriately to be able to resist damage from water coming from the spray head. But yeah, I think that from a trend standpoint, I think that would be a wonderful thing to kind of move that direction.
Yeah, thank you. T. Scott, pleasure. Thank you kindly for sharing your insight with us today.
Absolutely.